life and philosophy. Hi everyone, it's Shannon Lee.
And this is Sharon Lee.
And this is the Bruce Lee Podcast.
Welcome.
Hi everybody. Today we are going to start to talk about something that actually was requested by some of you and that we have been wanting to talk about as well, and those are the Bruce Lee affirmations.
So what are the Bruce Lee affirmations?
So my father he came up with 7 affirmations that he created and that he wrote down, and he would carry them in his wallet or in his day timer or whatever he had on him, and he would carry them around with him as a reminder of how he wanted to move through the world, approach the world, to remind himself a little bit of the qualities that were important to him, and he would just use them as a touch point. He'd pull them out, look at them on the daily, and be reminded about his process.
So just before we get into it, just so you guys have a visual description, one way that he wrote them down and carried them were just on plain 3x5 note cards, just everyday note cards. He hand wrote them in his meticulous handwriting, and so he must have carried them around in his pocket, or how did he move about with them?
You know, in his wallet, or he had these little daytimer notebooks that were really small. They were...
Yeah, they were like 2x3 or something, really small.
Really small, and he would put them in there sometimes. And in addition to these affirmations, he had a handful of quotes that he really liked and that were important to him. He would also carry. So he was very much about having access to what he deemed to be important on his person and at the ready.
Clearly he used them and needed them all the time, that it wasn't enough for him to just write them down and know them, is that he wanted them on his person and to like pull out and remind himself every day if he needed it, right?
Yeah, another way to look at it is sort of like, it's not exactly like a mantra, but the idea that you have a phrase, or you have a set of ideas, or you have a set of core values, you could say, or guidelines or principles that you just wanted to remind yourself of as you move through life, so that you could do it with the most skill that you could.
We can't go through all the affirmations in one episode, so we've broken them up into 3 different episodes. And so we'll start by just having Shannon, why don't you just read through the topics of all the affirmations, and then for this episode we're going to get into 3 of them, which is memory, subconscious mind, and imagination.
So the 7 affirmations are memory, subconscious mind, imagination, reason, emotion, conscience, and willpower.
So for the first 3, why don't we have you just read through the first one, and then we'll just kind of talk about each of the 3 for this episode.
So the first one we're going to talk about is memory, and this was the affirmation. Recognizing the value of an alert mind and an alert memory, I will encourage mine to become alert by taking care to impress it clearly with all thoughts I wish to recall, and by associating those thoughts with related subjects which I may call to mind frequently.
So what did he mean by memory? Because, you know, people might think memory is nostalgia or a story from a long time ago, or how you might just recall something that happened in the past. What did your dad mean about memory?
Before we talk about that, one thing I do want to say is all of these 7 affirmations are meant to work together as small pieces of a larger puzzle.
So they're one system.
Yeah. And so when we're talking about memory, we're just talking about one facet, right? And so that one facet is really about, it's not about, you know, memories, you know. It's more about, as he says, the value of an alert mind and an alert memory. It's about learning. It's about taking in thoughts, being clear about taking in information, about concentration, about an intelligent mind. It's about having presence of mind, and presence of mind to pull in the thoughts that are useful. Remember the old aphorism of his, take what is useful, reject what is useless. It's sort of like that. It's a little bit of a discerning mind as well that is going to pull in the thoughts and make associations to the bigger picture, essentially.
Also, he meant, when he talked about memory, that it wasn't just mind, right? It's mental memory and muscle memory.
Yeah, there are different types of memory. So it's really the art of practice and pulling in the things that you want and making them a part of your person so that actually, in a way, they become innate and you can kind of forget about them. So that's why we don't want to necessarily associate it just with the mind or just with memories, which pull up something that is sort of past and maybe seem like, well, they could be useful, they could not be useful. It's not memory for memory's sake. It's not just accumulation of knowledge, but really about synthesis and understanding at a cellular, deeper level.
It reminds me of our Be Water episode of just the beginning. It was like having an alert memory means that you have an empty cup, that you have the ability to absorb, and that your whole body and mind are flexible for learning.
Yes. And if you remember, my dad talked about being the eternal student. You always needed to empty your cup out a little bit so that there was room to take in everything that you're encountering and experiencing moment to moment. So it was not the idea of just like, oh, accumulation of knowledge and then there's no more room, there's nowhere else to go with it. It was really about never being done learning.
Part of why it's helpful in this podcast to kind of explain these things in detail is because words carry existing connotation and definitions, and Bruce Lee meant specific things. And so just to restate, memory in the way that Bruce Lee meant memory is not nostalgia for the past, or even this idea of rote memorization, the ability for the mind to just remember something and then be able to regurgitate it later. But it's more of this alertness, activeness, ability to absorb learning and teaching that eventually
really about thoughts as a gateway for a deeper understanding. And I think that what's important is you'll find, especially as we talk about these affirmations, that there are different levels that they can be interpreted at, and as Sharon just said, a very specific interpretation that my father is going with, which is why we want to be very clear to try and explain what was meant. And that memory is just one piece, as I said at the beginning, one facet, one piece of the puzzle that, when connected with all 7 of these affirmations, make up one area where he's saying, I am going to be conscious of this aspect, that I will encourage my mind to be alert and to take care to impress it clearly with the thoughts that I want to recall, the things that are meaningful to me.
And I think it bears repeating, so if you can just read the not memory for memory's sake quote, just so that people can understand and absorb it.
Yeah. Not memory for memory's sake, not accumulation of knowledge, but synthesis and application.
So again, everything for him is not a game of acquisition, it's all application, it's all going back out into action.
Yeah, I mean, and this is kind of a heady concept, but the idea is the knowledge and skill you have achieved are, after all, meant to be forgotten, so that you can float within emptiness without obstruction and comfortably. So that it's like, the idea is that you take in all this knowledge, you let it impact you, you let it deepen your understanding of your own experience, and then you kind of let it go so that it can just work on you, and so that you can really, I would say it's like the art of ingraining. It's the art of
it's
evolution.
Like marinating in you.
Yeah, right, exactly. Because he did say that all thought is partial, that memory is partial because it's the result of experience. So it's really just one aspect of the greater picture.
And so it's important to know that this was one of those affirmations that he'd pull out. It's on a card. He would read it and sometimes read these things daily. So he needed a reminder of this too.
Right. And I think if you think about it, there are times when you're going through your life and you're not being present and you're not being conscious and you're just sort of like sometimes maybe even in a confusion of your daily routine, and you realize I'm just going through my life. I'm not actively engaging with it. And this was a way to sort of re-trigger for him his active engagement.
So that's memory. Let's go to subconscious mind.
Okay. The affirmation for subconscious mind is reorganizing the influence of my subconscious mind over my power of will. I shall take care to submit to it a clear and definite picture of my major purpose in life and all minor purposes leading to my major purpose, and I shall keep this picture constantly before my subconscious mind by repeating it daily.
It seems like something, especially this part, that he needed to present his conscious mind with something daily.
Right. I also want to talk about this concept of subconscious mind, right? Because to us, and I think generally, the subconscious is something that we think of as something that we're not aware of. And I think he's understanding that too. But a lot of times our subconscious mind is really the driver of a lot of what we're doing. And it's our duty to become more aware of what is going on in our subconscious and present to our subconscious what we want to be conscious about so that we can influence our mind in both its aware and unaware forms toward the pursuit of, as he called it, his major purpose in life.
So did he think that the subconscious mind was really controlling things, and so then he wanted to kind of present affirmations in front of it, or what did he think about that?
Well, he really thought of the subconscious mind. I mean, he has a quote. He said, "The subconscious mind favors thoughts inspired by emotional feelings. It also gives preference to dominating thoughts." So I think what he's saying is that the subconscious mind, that part of our mind that is maybe a little below the surface, is the place where it's been influenced for a long time by our unique intrinsic essence, and it's also influenced by how we were raised and our life experiences, and oftentimes it's inspired by a feeling that kind of starts to present itself in these dominating thoughts, or sometimes, as we like to call them, our tapes that get played, and that we can become aware of what those things are, but it takes some real attention and focus to look at the feeling of your mind, right? And sort of poke around in there and say, okay, these are the things I keep thinking all the time, or these are the things that keep happening all the time, or these are the places where I struggle in my life or come up against obstacles. And how can I have some sway or some influence over that part of my mind that's maybe operating a little bit under the surface, so that I can help to gently urge it in the direction of what I'm really working towards and what I consciously am going for in my life.
So if the subconscious mind favors thoughts inspired by emotional feelings and dominating thoughts, do you think that part of what he did was to cultivate emotional feelings that were somehow then feeding the subconscious mind, and that was part of his daily affirmations?
Yeah, so like as we talked about before, even with the one we just talked about, memory, right? He's saying, I'm going to imprint with my alert mind these ideas that are important to clearly sort of direct my thoughts, if you will. as we said, these are all pieces of a puzzle, right? So we're going to talk about emotion later, and we're going to talk about willpower and imagination and how this all fits together. And really it's all about bringing, if you will, sort of the yin and yang of the mind together into one, and not just the mind, but the mind as part of our whole being, into harmony so that we're all working towards one purpose.
Yeah, I mean, this is a recognition that there's many levels to the mind that he's operating in, and it's not just this kind of one linear path of, you know, left to right and logic being kind of the only way at your mind. And by the way, this is in many, many years before the mainstreaming of psychotherapy and, you know, psychology. This is like super cutting edge stuff that he's talking about, like, you know, when he was alive, right, to like understand that there is this subconscious mind. And he says, I am the power that commands the feeling of my mind and from which circumstances grow. So this kind of very, you know, some would say like the new age idea of a higher self is like you are the awareness, you are not the mind. You are the awareness observing the mind, that you know, there's that space that he was fully aware and playing in that kind of space of just understanding the complexity and all the different layers that his mind was working in way back before it was part of the popular culture to be talking about.
Yeah, he would also say man's mind and his behavior are one. You know, it's an ecosystem, right? Like the way you react, the things you struggle with, the things you do or say, or these dominating thoughts you have, these tapes that you play over and over in your head about who you are as a person. All of these things affect how you are in the world, right? And so they manifest, or they feel like they manifest in your mind, but they're really a part of your entire being.
Yeah, no, I find it really interesting that a lot of times our solutions to, you know, what's happening in our lives, or the thoughts that we're thinking, or the things that are happening are at this surface level by the time they've already become something that's manifested in the world, right? You might be working on something that's a challenge for you, but you're just approaching it by the time it's already done.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that what he's saying is, no, it's all happening in the subconscious mind before it happens, so you want to actively have a relationship with that subconscious mind.
Right. He said the intangible represents the real power of the universe. It is the seed of the tangible.
So it's getting at the seed level. It's like influencing at the seed level before it's already like some, you know, like invasive species that are like completely raiding your garden, and then you're having to like hack away at it. It's a lot more work. If you have a relationship with your subconscious mind and you're feeding your subconscious mind, then you are able to influence what's happening to you.
Right. And he talked a lot too. There are many quotes about his saying that the root, we're after the root. It's not the branches, right? It's not where the flowers and the leaves are. It's the root we need to work on. And I think we can think of our subconscious mind as the root in a lot of ways.
All right, great. So let's go to the next one. Imagination.
Imagination. Recognizing the need for sound plans and ideas for the attainment of my desires, I will develop my imagination by calling upon it daily for help in the formation of my plans.
Okay, so what did he mean? How did he call upon his imagination daily?
Well, he's talking about creativity, right? He's talking about creative intuition. He had many ways in which he did that or executed that in his life. And in a way, it's also a little bit about the subconscious mind. If we think about the subconscious mind as the place where dreams sort of bubble up from, or fantastical ideas, this is, your imagination is a place where you can let that come up, percolate to the surface, and play with that and create daily practices for cultivating your creativity, creative thinking and doing. And that creativity is actually the key to originating and innovating, right? It's the place that really springs up out of the essence of you.
There's one quote that I'm reminded of is, be a practical dreamer backed by action. It seems like you can be dreaming and imagining, but the way that he's talking about imagination is really, again, about manifesting creativity.
It's about application, right? So he's saying, I'm going to develop my imagination by calling upon it to help me in the formation of my plans, of the pursuit of my goals.
Well, so this affirmation really shines light on how some people are wowed and perplexed by how much of a Renaissance man your dad was, and he was writing poetry, creating art, designing shoes and equipment and acting and dancing and creating beverages, like all manner of things. And in our linear world where you're supposed to just be expert at one thing, or it doesn't make sense, if in the realm of his imagination, it makes so much sense that there's no limitation to his imaginative thinking or the creative application for that imaginative thinking.
Definitely. I mean, he really believed that your mind had infinite possibility, infinite access, that there should be no limit, right? Using no way is way, having no limitation is limitation. He believed in creativity and the use of the imagination as putting it into service toward the cultivation of who he was and what his plans were, and letting it just ooze out of him in whatever way it wanted to manifest in the world, and then going from there.
The way he's talking about imagination and creativity, it feels very spiritual. It's not just a creative act, quote unquote, but it's a manifestation of his inner light. So would you read this creative intuition quote, because it kind of speaks to that?
Creative intuition opens the well springs within man, activates the inner light, and is free and limitless.
Yeah, that again goes to these limitations or these artificial categories that we create in our mind about what things should be. If you're truly in the flow of imagination and creative intuition, none of that exists. It's totally open.
Right, and I like the combination of creativity and intuition, because intuition, that sudden feeling, that sudden thought, that sudden idea that comes to us sometimes is our essence sort of speaking to us, but then to take it and create with it is really about cultivating the self, and it really can go anywhere.
Yeah, and I think that's the dreamer part of it, is just this openness, this imagination channel. Because I think if you have no limitation and you have this whole wellspring of imagination, it's almost like any solution is possible. Any creation is possible. Any shift is possible. An ability to move kind of at light speed and transform is possible. But then when it's backed by action, yes, this is the important thing, is to kind of not stay in this dreamland state with everything Bruce Lee.
Exactly. I mean, the thing about my father, which is the reason we're still talking about him today, is not just his words and ideas, but the fact that he put them into action, that he physicalized them. He put all of this into physical form in the physical world, which is why we have it.
Also, sometimes you see examples of creativity and they have a kind of fast food feeling to them, meaning that they're great in the moment, you really love it, and then later on you're like, ugh, like whatever, or you forget them. That it's different when the feeling is lasting, and in fact it kind of grows. And I'm just wondering out loud, I mean, it just seems like because his creativity was coming from this spiritual space, that it carries a completely different energy to it. And part of why it's so resonating and lasting, because it's a little bit unexplainable, right? It's unexplainable from a logical standpoint. Like, why are we talking about it? Why are people so moved? It's not like any of his movies are like the best movies ever made. It's not logical why they have such deep, heartfelt resonance with people. But it's just an idea that I've been thinking about, just like, oh, it comes from this like pure place, and And especially this quote. Would you read that? Because I think this speaks to it.
Yeah. There can be no true creativity with ego rigidity.
So much of creative accomplishment these days is about ego. It's about somebody's status. It's about somebody wanting to be known or praised or these kinds of things. But if he's trying to come at it from this pure egoless root place, maybe that's why everyone has such an emotional connection to it, because it feels so differently from creativity that's created from the ego.
Yeah, because the ego by its very nature is rigid. It's this picture of something that is very stalwart and in control, right?
Control.
Creativity is something that's much more fluid and much more free and open. And to use that creativity in service of the cultivation of self, and when we think of self, a lot of time we think of ego, right? But we're talking about the essence of self, sort of the energy. I think that's why when you see him in those movies, you feel his life force. You feel his energy, and it's because he's sort of generating this creative, fluid, strong, palpable thing out at you that was his journey to enhance.
But it's also a gifting to you.
Yeah.
So it's flowing, and it's not just flowing to make you think he's more impressive, although that happens too, but somehow it's being gifted to you. So lots of people who are fans who talk to you or have, talk about what it means to experience him have that, testimony. Is just like, oh, it was like somehow that energy was gifted to them, and then it helps them carry on.
Right, because part of his whole philosophy, if we remember, is relating. It's of being in harmony with his environment. So when you say it's gifted to you, it's really like you're taking it in. It's not just a show. It's somehow a communication.
Yeah, and it's a connection.
Connection, right.
It's also, something that he sought with everything that he did was the freedom for him to fully express himself, right? He was searching for that and practicing that his whole life. And so then by him showing you that in such kind of grand example is my mind and my heart gets expanded and thinking, oh, like I'm capable of that freedom.
Yeah.
I'm capable of whatever's flowing through him. I'm capable of that too. What is that,
Yeah, it's so wild that, like, when you see him, you don't just go like, wow, impressive. You go, wow, that's possible.
Right. Normally when we admire somebody and put them on a pedestal, it only increases our insecurity. It's like, oh, they're so great, I suck. Or the feeling of smallness of, wow, I didn't know that was possible, but now I feel jealous or I feel inadequate in some way. But it's interesting when you can have that feeling of admiration and then also feel so expanded and so like energized by it. So it's just like interesting how those examples can exist in the world.
Yeah.
So let's just recap a little bit. We've covered a lot: memory, subconscious mind, and then imagination. And so these are 3 out of the 7, but just how are the 3 of these already just kind of working together?
Yeah, they're working together in that they're really talking about the taking in, the impressing upon the mind, and then the sort of let go as well, to be free and open. So there's a quote where he says, "The freedom to be open and not tethered by any ideas, concepts, etc. exists here and now. It requires only one thing to see it: openness and freedom." We can go on rehearsing, analyzing, attending lectures until we're blue in the face. I think of that as like the memory, right? Like the bringing in of the thoughts I want to impress upon myself. All this will be only of the slightest avail. It is only when we stop thinking and let go that we can start seeing and discovering. When our mind is tranquil, There will be an occasional pause to its feverish activities. There will be a let go, and it is only then, in an interval between two thoughts, that a flash of understanding which is not thought, can take place.
You know what's so interesting about this? As you were reading this, I just had a memory. First of all, we all get obsessed with knowledge acquisition, right? We just want to cram as much possible. Like, we feel insecure, so that if I just had that course, if I just read that book, if I just listen to the podcast, whatever, that we're in this kind of feverish acquisition. But he's saying, yeah, all that is good, actually. All the education is good as long as you're taking it in with a flexible, supple mind. Mm-hmm. But at a certain point, once it marinates, then you have to let it all go and then trust that these eureka, the creativity, all that comes in that quiet space in between. Mm-hmm. And years ago, I read this book called Mind Wide Open, and it's about fMRI scans and scanning the brain because they wanted to understand what happens to the brain right before a eureka moment. Like, when you think of a great idea, what's happening? And the hypothesis was, oh my God, there must be like this crazy electricity that's going on. Like, it's just going nuts. Like, it's all the boards are lighting up because this great idea is happening. And in fact, it was like the total opposite. It almost goes like blackout. Like, it all shuts down and goes quiet before a big idea comes, because it's like it needs that quiet space for this whatever creative idea to emerge. And so intuitively, great thinkers and monks and other people have come to know this truth before we had the technology to scan the brain.
Right. Yeah, no, he's saying it's the interval between the two thoughts, right? It's that moment of space. It's like you've given yourself all this education, you've analyzed, you've filled your mind with facts, and you've written down ideas and all this stuff, and then all of a sudden you have this quiet, and that gives you the space for that thing to percolate to the surface.
So as you're studying Bruce Lee's philosophy, it's all good to take in at a certain point. Give yourself the trust and space to let it all flow out again, let it go, and see what happens.
Yeah.
I know we've covered a lot. Bruce Lee had a few idea principles that we want to share that kind of naturally become action items.
Yeah.
So let's just cover that so that people who are interested in kind of putting these principles into action can experiment with it.
Yeah. So the 4 idea principles are: find a human need, an unsolved problem. Master all of the essentials of the problem. Give a new twist to an old principle. Believe in your idea, and act.
And that's kind of an ambitious way to act out on the action item.
Right.
A more manageable action item for this discussing these next 3 episodes is that you guys can take your own 3x5 cards and start writing down your own affirmations.
Yeah.
And it could just fill 1 card, and they don't even have to come from you necessarily. You can just have a few quotes that are really inspiring to you, that if you carried them around on your body and you took them out and read them, that they would somehow put you in a creative flow state. So that's a really manageable way to action what we're talking about, and you'd be following in the footsteps of Bruce Lee, who was doing this.
Yep, definitely. When I mention those idea principles, like find a human need, an unsolved problem, it all sounds really heavy and big, but like a human need can just be your own need, you're human, what do you need?
What problem do you want to solve for yourself?
Think on the problem, pull together some quotes, ideas, thoughts about it, and then give your mind the freedom to sort of play with that, and then act on it, believe in it, go for it. And I think it's right, consider what some of your affirmations might be. Consider what you want to work on.
I think that it's really important to take from this lesson is just that it's daily application. It's